Again, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the 19th Annual Palmer Lecture in Canadian Studies. 19 years. It goes by very quickly, doesn't it? Our speaker today has been a law professor in Nova Scotia and in Alberta. She is currently associated with one of Canada's preeminent law firms, Bennett Jones, and serves on numerous corporate, community, academic, and humanitarian boards. Among other positions, she has been Canada's Minister of Health, Minister of Justice and Attorney General, and Minister of Natural Resources. She has also served as the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. Please welcome the Honourable Anne McLellan.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And first of all, I want to say this is my first visit to Brigham Young campus, and I can't imagine a more beautiful day on which to share my first visit here with all of you. And I do thank you all for coming. I especially thank the Palmer family. I've had the opportunity to meet a few of the family, Byron and his wife especially, and Linda this morning, but I know that there are others of you here, and I want to say, on behalf, I think, of all Canadians, I used to be in government. I still talk on behalf of all Canadians, but I do think I want to express the appreciation of all Canadians that the Palmer family has made possible this lecture here at Brigham Young in memory and in honor of Asil and Medell Palmer. And I was reading about their contributions to their adopted country, Canada. And like so many others who emigrated to Canada from other parts of the world, they made significant contributions to their community and their chosen country, and truly are examples of building a better community, a better world, and giving back. So I want to thank the Palmer family for making this lecture possible, because I do think it is very important that here in the United States that there's the opportunity to think about your neighbors, both Canada and Mexico, more generally, globally, here in this wonderful International Studies Center. We do live in a global world, and it's very important for us to take every opportunity possible to learn more about each other. So a heartfelt thanks to the Palmer family for making this lecture possible here at Brigham Young. I do want to say that I have taught many students who did their undergraduate work at Brigham Young. I taught in the law school at the University of Alberta for over 13 years before going into federal politics. And I had a number of outstanding students who did their undergraduate work here at Brigham Young and then came to the University of Alberta Law School. They were all very conscientious, they were all hardworking, and they all seemed to be hockey players. So I bet if I checked, and I asked Earl this last night, if I went through the roster of the Brigham Young hockey team, I would find an awful lot of Canadian guys playing on that team. And it seems as if I taught quite a few of them at the University of Alberta Law School. So it is a pleasure for me to be here today. Now I'm going to press this button, and there's my one and only slide. You'll be relieved that I only have one slide. But what I do want to talk to you today about for the next 30 minutes or so, and I do want there to be time for questions. So if toward the end, if I start to flip the pages vigorously, I'm moving forward quickly and perhaps leaving things out to get to your comments and questions. So this is a quote that comes, it's very small down here, you can hardly see it, but it comes from a report written by the Council on Foreign Relations, which is one of America's best known entities, non-governmental entities, that does outstanding work on issues of keen interest to the United States, but to the world. And probably some of you have studied their reports in the work that you do here at the International Studies Center. This was a report written or published in spring of 2005 by the Council on Foreign Relations, and it was entitled Building a North American Community. And it was co-chaired by my then, or former colleague by that point, also a former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, John Manley, by William Weld, who was the former governor of the state of Massachusetts, and Pedro Aspe, who was the former finance minister of the country of Mexico. And this quote puts into play what I want to talk about today. And really what this quote asks is what the future will be for North America. They're reflecting at this point on really 11 years history with NAFTA. We are now celebrating the 15th anniversary of NAFTA this year. It came into force in January 1994. And the question they ask is an important one. And basically, as you can see, and I know Carol has warned me not to read the content of the slide, but the question does frame everything I say. And that is, do they, the three countries, continue on the path of cooperation? Or do they pursue divergent and ultimately less secure and less prosperous courses? And that is the question I want to address today. This quote acknowledges positively the shared interests and increased integration of the North American region. It then poses a key question or challenge which the authors, at least in 2005, went so far as to say that to ask the question was to answer it. It was self-evident to the authors of the report that there was only one sensible answer: to continue, as they say, on the course of further cooperation and, one presumes, integration. The report states that for the three countries to find themselves on divergent paths would be a tragic mistake, and that is the report's language. But today, 4 years later, it seems that the answer to the question asked by the Council on Foreign Relations may not be so self-evident, at least to some in Canada. And here, when I talk about we, I will almost always be talking about Canada. This paper is written from my perspective and from what I believe to be a Canadian perspective. And when I'm not talking about we in the context of Canada, I will try and make that plain. If things have changed for us in Canada, what has changed and why? It seems that there is a growing opinion, at least among some, that trilateralism, the work of the three countries together, has not worked for Canada. Former Ambassador to the United States, Derek Burney, would seem to be the chief proponent of this theory or opinion. He was also a key negotiator of the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. But he has been joined by others, including Tom DeCino, who is the Executive Director of the Canada Council of Chief Executives. Rather surprisingly, John Manley, one of the co-chairs of this report, who asked this question, and former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Gordon Giffen, recently wrote an op-ed for the Globe and Mail in which they called for a table for two, not three, saying that Canada and the U.S. should define a new and evolutionary template for our bilateral progress. And then there is Carleton University's Canada-U.S. project, led by Derek Burney and Fen Hampson, which was a major national dialogue in our country last year, the purpose of which was to reinvigorate the Canada-U.S. relationship. They argued that border, regulatory, energy security, environmental, and defense issues were best resolvable through a robust bilateral agenda. There's not much left when you look at the areas they have identified as being subject to a bilateral agenda. So, what is driving this renewed call for bilateralism in Canada after 15 years of NAFTA, years which can only be described as tremendously beneficial to all three countries, at least as it relates to trade and investment? And here, just a few numbers. Since NAFTA came into effect, trade among the NAFTA partners has more than tripled, reaching approximately $894 billion in 2007. Over the same period, Canada-U.S. trade has more than doubled, while trade between Mexico and the U.S. has quadrupled. Exchange between NAFTA partners is about $2.5 billion worth of goods and services every day. And North America employment levels have climbed nearly 24% since 1994, representing a net gain of 39.9 million jobs in the three countries. In my opinion, the following factors are relevant in understanding this apparent change of attitude and approach in Canada. One, there is a belief that the benefits of both the FTA and NAFTA, the FTA was superseded by NAFTA, are being undermined by the U.S. approach to homeland security after 9/11. The common refrain heard in Canada is that the border is thickening, that we see a proliferation of non-tariff barriers in the name of national security, and that Canada is losing out. There is a perceived growing desire on the part of the United States to secure both their northern and southern borders in similar ways, not in identical ways, but with growing policy convergence. Canadian reaction was swift when Janet Napolitano suggested that both the southern and northern borders were real borders to the United States. Napolitano has said her job is to be a myth buster, and that one of the myths she is trying to bust is that there is no real border between Canada and the United States. Canadian governments have consistently and vigorously argued since 9/11 that the two borders are different and must be treated differently. In fairness to Napolitano, she does acknowledge while there is one U.S. law dealing with their borders, that law will be implemented based on an assessment of risk, which will involve separate approaches. And maybe finally, in terms of what's driving this change in Canadian attitude, is at root the feeling that the United States is indifferent to us, and that to deal with that U.S. indifference or inattention to Canadian concerns, we need to convince U.S. leaders that Canada matters and that Canadian issues are important. And there I'm quoting Derek Burney. And beyond that Canada's special relationship or unique bilateral relationship with the U.S. is being at best complicated by Mexico and at worst undermined by Mexico's presence at the table. Now, I do not suggest that this bilateral objective of convincing U.S. leaders that Canada and its issues matter is not essential to our long-term prosperity and security as a country. But I think we can and should challenge the proposed means by which to deal with this situation, basically reverting to a bilateral agenda where we, Canadians, plaintively invoke the language of a special relationship to the exclusion of our other NAFTA partner, Mexico. My concern is not that we shouldn't deal with the United States bilaterally on certain issues, nor that we should not continue to point out important differences between America's southern and northern borders. And conveniently, the Institute has a map there for us all to focus on. Rather, it is that too much of what is being written suggests that Canada must choose between bilateralism and trilateralism, that one, trilateralism, must undermine the other, bilateralism, that one, trilateralism, must erode our special relationship with the United States. I do not accept that it needs to be either or. Both approaches have served Canada well in the past, depending on the issue at hand, and I believe will continue to do so in the future. Now, what is the Mexican reaction to this apparent change in attitude in Canada? Because the Mexicans have been watching this very carefully. First, I would say they're hurt and confused, and we should not underestimate the impact of hurt feelings in the world of foreign relations. One example of these hurt feelings, a recent op-ed written by Andreas Rosenthal, who Earl, I think, knows quite well, former Deputy Foreign Minister of Mexico, founding President of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, where he seems both bemused and confused by Canada's approach, where he talks of recently to the affairs of North America, Canada's approach to the affairs of North America, accentuating differences rather than similarities and ignoring areas on which effort would be of benefit to all three countries. He writes, the idea that Canada has a unique, special relationship with the United States that somehow differentiates it from Mexico and other countries with which Washington has close ties, has done much damage to the concept of an integrated North America and has stymied efforts by those of us who strongly believe in the advantages of building a North American community. A recent decision by the Canadian government requiring visas for any Mexican national wishing to visit Canada has compounded further these hurt feelings. Mexicans complain about the way the requirement was implemented. I have heard frequently, is this any way to treat a neighbor or a partner? While Prime Minister Stephen Harper has attempted to smooth relations with President Calderon at the recent North American Leaders Summit in Guadalajara in August by blaming Canada's refugee system for the flow of bogus claims, these efforts have clearly not worked. And by the way, I do not disagree with the Prime Minister that we need to do some work at home around our refugee system. He's right about that. But his effort was to smooth ruffled feelings in Mexico from the highest level because Calderon himself had spoken about the imposition of the visas. And that is what I am saying clearly has not worked to date. A senior Mexican senator and former Foreign Affairs Minister, Rosario Green, used the word humiliating to describe Canada's visa controls in her speech to a business and academic gathering in Toronto recently. Her comments were made at the launch of the Mexico-Canada Initiative, an undertaking of a group called FOCAL and the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. Senator Green bluntly stated, and this was quoted in our daily papers, this has to stop. The humiliation of Mexico, in her opinion, and argued that in response to this and other issues, the North American Free Trade Agreement should be relaunched with a new attitude that recognized Mexico as an equal partner with Canada and the United States and not as an irritant. She later made the undiplomatic statement that the relationship will only improve when you change prime ministers. As Dale Eisler, who is the Consul General here, it would be very rare. It would be exceptional. I think it would be a career-limiting move if any Canadian diplomat ever said that about someone else's leader. At a more concrete level, NAFTA was an important step for Mexico. It was a developing country, and it signaled willingness in Mexico to accept greater regional partnership and integration as part of North America. And as you are all well aware, Mexico is pulled in two directions, to the south and to the north. And NAFTA, we underestimate, at least in Canada, I'm not sure that America does, how important it was when Mexico decided, if you like, to throw their lot in with their northern neighbors and become part of NAFTA. As Isabel Studer, who directs the Center for Dialogue and Analysis on North America in Monterrey, has said, the NAFTA process of integration had important symbolic value that indicated the vision of a modern country, Mexico, ready to face the issues associated with globalization. And as a result of NAFTA, Mexico did undertake important reforms in domestic legislation in areas such as intellectual property rights, competition law, and foreign direct investment. And none of those changes were without controversy within the domestic political agenda of Mexico. In Mexico, many see NAFTA as only a small step toward a more integrated North America. Many in Mexico argue that integration should mean more than increasing trade and investment. NAFTA did not bring the wide prosperity and improvement to quality of life that some had promised. So Mexico, more than its northern partners, has advocates for enhancing integration, albeit with its share of critics, and sees recent Canadian musings as a slap in the face, a tone deafness to the leap of faith that Mexicans took when they turned their face north. Finally, Mexicans see that they and Canada can make common cause on a number of important issues when dealing with Washington, and that two may be more influential than one in a capital where the world vies for attention and action. Buy America is a recent example where both countries are being impacted adversely, and both Prime Minister Harper and President Calderon have shared their concerns with President Obama at the recent summit in Guadalajara. Mexico's and Canada's two trade ministers, meeting with their American counterpart last month in Texas, made their shared concerns known again around the impact of Buy American on the economies and certain industrial sectors in those two countries. Another area I would suggest in which Canada should be more alert to common concerns is in relation to Mexico's ongoing drug wars. Guns and money flow south from the United States to help fuel these wars, a fact that the United States has acknowledged. But the drug cartels are starting to extend their tentacles north into Canada, bringing not only their drugs, but increased gang violence. In addition, most of the handguns and assault weapons used by gangs and others on the streets of Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, and Toronto have come to Canada illegally from the United States, just as they have in Mexico. So I think another area where the two countries can work not in an aggressive way with the United States, but in a cooperative way, because the U.S. has acknowledged that they are part of Mexico's and Canada's challenge in this area. So I think there is enormous potential for collaborative work among the three countries as Mexico more directly and more specifically deals with their challenges around drug cartels and gang violence. And as many, even my American friends in state point out, was actually when the U.S. shut down the trade routes to move the drugs through the Caribbean. The American Navy and Coast Guard were so successful at shutting down those routes that moved illicit drugs from further south that Mexico started to become this major transit point for illegal drugs. And I think the Americans feel quite rightly that Mexico's challenge in this regard is their challenge. My argument is that it is also Canada's challenge. And what do the Americans think about Canada's renewed interest in bilateralism to the exclusion of Mexico? It is probably not possible to be definitive with a new administration in Washington dealing with the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, wrapping up one war, becoming a dominant presence in another, dealing with spiraling health costs where at least 40 million people have no or inadequate health coverage, and a higher real employment rate than most can remember. Probably what they want is no trouble in the neighborhood, or the hood, as President George W. Bush used to refer to it. I had a number of meetings with the president and my counterparts, and I loved it. I actually did. I loved it when George W. Bush referred to the NAFTA countries, or by extension sometimes the Caribbean, Haiti, as the hood. Because in fact, it actually does tell you something about how I think the United States views this part of the world. There is a sense of protective, putting it at its best, I suppose, a sense of protective self-interest in the hood. But I think it's probably not a bad thing for the President of the United States to think of Canada and Mexico as being part of his neighborhood. As I mentioned, as with neighbors, the Americans want us to be supportive and helpful in times of difficulty or crisis and not distract them from more pressing concerns. Now, we do know that President Obama has said a number of things about the importance of Mexico, at least, to the U.S. domestic and foreign agenda. President Obama has also made significant interventions with our Prime Minister, and obviously his first foreign visit was to Canada. His first foreign visitor, Obama's, in Washington was President Calderon, and then, of course, Obama went to Mexico in April of this year. It has been said that President Obama's visit to Mexico in April was a symbolic show of support for a somewhat besieged President Calderon, offering reassurance that the United States would continue to support efforts on crime and drug violence, migration issues, border issues, and ongoing structural reform of the Mexican economy. Now, I am skipping along here, Earl, because I see the time is passing. The Secretary of State Clinton has noted that trilateral consultation is the kind of partnership that the U.S. is very committed to not only building, but really deepening and broadening. And she said that at a trilateral foreign affairs ministers meeting in July of 2009. But it is hard to believe that this administration will want to use up much depleting political capital to develop a new or enhanced strategy for the further development of a North American community. Domestic critics, as you know better than me, in this country are many, including Lou Dobbs, the labor unions, and what I like to refer to as the conspiracy theorists. These are people who actually believe that George W. Bush was in league with people in Mexico and Canada to create one supranational state. in which apparently everybody would be speaking Spanish. I think we Canadians might have preferred the conspiracy theorists to suggest everybody would be speaking French, but that's another issue. However, the U.S. might hope that Canada would step up to the plate and put some brain power and resources behind the challenges facing the North American region, and in particular, those facing our Mexican partner. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but I think many of you know that the challenges facing Mexico are very real. And here there is an important point. Mexico is a fledgling democracy. It is the emerging economy of the three NAFTA countries. Canada and the United States have had stable democracies for many years. Mexico has really only had a stable democracy, and I realize there are many indicia by which you can define that, since 2000. It was the first time there had been a peaceful transfer of power. Vincent to an opposition member. Vicente Fox was of the PAN party. PRI had governed Mexico for 70 years. That was the first peaceful transition of power to an opposition member in the history of Mexico. We forget that, but we need to remember it because it tells us that this is a new democracy and that they have done enormously well, and they have come a long distance in a short time. But right now, there is a degree of political instability largely created by the economic situation that I can assure you people in the State Department are watching very, very carefully. And here is my bottom line here. People in the State Department have told me they don't understand what Canada doesn't get about that. They don't understand that Canada seems willing in this bilateral, trilateral discussion that's going on in our country to cut Mexico loose at a time when Mexico needs the support and help of its two senior developed partners in NAFTA. And what the guys in state tell me is, you know, what we don't understand is that you people in Canada have got to know that Mexico matters to us. It matters to us in our domestic politics. It matters to us in our foreign policy. And what we don't understand is why Canadians, if you know it matters to us, why you're not stepping up to the plate here and understanding it should matter to you. I'm not suggesting there's an implicit threat in that. I think it is the language of real politics. What matters to the United States should matter to Canada. And right now, Mexico matters to the United States in a way that we have not seen in quite some time because they are afraid that political instability will grow in Mexico. And what is it America does not want on their southern border? Another Hugo Chavez. They don't want Venezuela on their southern border. And I am here to say that Canada should not want Venezuela on America's southern border. So the Americans here, I actually go back when I say perhaps there's not a definitive answer from this new administration. In fact, there is a definitive answer, and it's pretty clear. And there are some tone-deaf people in our country who are not listening. And dare I say, some of them are in the Department of Foreign Affairs and elsewhere. If Mexico matters to the United States, Mexico matters to us. Otherwise, America will be indifferent to us. And that's what we're trying to deal with here. Anyway, so much for that small rant on my part. I am flipping through my comments because I do see that time is moving on. I think that we can, as Canadians, lend a helping hand to the Americans in the neighborhood. Instead of attempting to exclude Mexico from important continental discussions, let's ensure that we include Mexico wherever that makes sense. Let's make more of an effort to understand both the challenges and priorities of Mexico and do what we reasonably can to help them meet those challenges and deliver on their priorities. In my opinion, that would be both the right thing to do for a good friend and partner, Mexico, and a smart strategic thing to do when we know our other partner, the United States, would like some support in helping Mexico deal with these problems. I've always believed that enlightened self-interest is not a bad thing. Now, very briefly, I just want to make some comments about the way forward, at least as I see a possible way forward for the three countries that comprise the North American region. First, and most importantly, because all else will flow from the answer to this question, is there a belief in the three countries that something called North America goes beyond a mere geographic reference? That NAFTA was the beginning of the development of an integrated, competitive, productive space, not the end. We know that the intended benefits of NAFTA are being eroded, particularly since 9/11. If we in Canada believe there is something worth preserving here, something worth building on for the future, then it seems to me that trying to exclude Mexico from discussions on the border and other aspects of continental security are counterproductive. As opposed to working toward a seamless, integrated approach to borders in North America, we will have Canada and Mexico going to Washington separately, vying for attention and action. If it is true that the U.S. is actually moving to a one-border policy, similar treatment north and south, then it probably makes sense for Canada to work with Mexico to try and influence those border policies. And I'm not going to talk at any length about this, but sooner or later we're going to have to embrace the discussion around perimeter. This is a very difficult political discussion to have in all three countries. And there's not a lot of domestic support in the three countries, more in Mexico than the other two, but still, not a lot of support for a discussion of perimeter. But if we're going to make this North American space work, if we're going to take it beyond what we've got now in NAFTA, we have to push the borders of this region out. I am not arguing that it will be a model like the European Union, but the European Union, as you all know, is largely borderless for most important aspects of the movement of trade, goods, people, money, and so on. We have got to seriously start to look at this if we're serious about North America as a region. And let me just say as well that the only people talking about this can't be business, because civil society then begins to think that there's a hidden agenda, that this is only about a corporate agenda. Wealth creation for big multinational corporations and so on. In fact, we in civil society, here in this place, in Canada, in other places, other venues in the United States and Canada and Mexico, civil society needs to have an informed dialogue and discussion about whether we believe there's enough here worth preserving and building on to move forward and create a true North American region or space that benefits the people of all three countries. Now, very briefly, the issues that I think all three countries have to work on, because they are in the shared self-interest of all three. And no one country can deal with these issues alone. The economic recovery in the North American region. Canada, in comparison to the U.S. and Mexico, has suffered less, but both Canada and Mexico need the United States to recover. Energy security. The United States needs energy. Canada is the United States' single largest provider of oil and gas. Mexico is number 3. Mexico's resources are depleting. They're going to become a net importer by 2013. It's going to be a hugely political issue in Mexico. It's going to lead to more instability unless the three countries working together figure out how we make this energy security equation work in these three countries. We can do it, but we need to do a lot more work together. Continental environmental issues, including climate change and water. These issues cannot be dealt with alone, any one country, regardless of how big or powerful you are. This region will require the three countries working together. Emergency preparedness is another area where North American partnerships should continue to be strengthened. And I use H1N1 and Hurricane Katrina as examples. In fact, the way the three countries work together and shared resources on H1N1 has been described by the WHO as an example of regional cooperation that others around the world could follow. So, finally, Mexico. Why is it in Canada's interest not to cut the Mexicans loose? Well, Mexico is going to be in the G20. It's in APEC already. It's in the OAS, like Canada and the U.S. President Obama invited Mexico to the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate. That's 17 countries dealing with two of the biggest issues facing the world. Secretary of State Clinton has stated that she hopes that Canada, the U.S., and Mexico can offer a united front in world venues. If the U.S. comes to the table at international discussions or negotiations with two allies, it should strengthen their hand. And Mexico may be a bridge to some of the developing or emerging economies and their issues, where there still exists considerable suspicion of America's real intentions and motives. And Prime Minister Harper has announced that Latin America will become an area of increased focus for our diplomatic and trade initiatives. Again, Mexico can be enormously helpful in helping develop and really form one of the foundation blocks of that Latin American strategy. Finally, North America cannot afford to pull apart as the rest of the world is pulling together in tighter regional economic groupings. The European Union has welcomed new members and before the economic meltdown had become the world's largest trading zone, a distinction that had been held by guess who? The NAFTA countries. The Southern Cone, together with other Latin American countries, is coming together under a trading arrangement known as Mercosur, and the Asian countries are consolidating their ties to China. We can't stand still and let the rest of the world overtake us, forming new, more efficient, and more powerful trading relationships. We are behind the rest of the world in addressing regionalization as the next important global economic cycle. Globalization, interesting. We are now entering, many would suggest, a new economic cycle called regionalization. We have a natural advantage. NAFTA, these three countries, if we're willing to take up the challenge and build on what we have. And in fact, there's a guy in Canada called Jeff Rubin who's written a book. He's the former chief economist for CIBC, one of our major banks. His book is entitled Why Our World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller. It's all about triple-digit oil, 200 a barrel oil. And Jeff Rubin's point relates to the regionalization argument. Part of what's driving regionalization is transportation costs. If you've got $200 a barrel oil, you are probably going to be less likely to transport a whole lot of goods from China or Australia or wherever other parts of the world. You're going to be looking closer to home. How do we figure out these three countries with their wealth of creativity and innovation in the U.S., natural resources in Canada, and reasonably priced labor in Mexico? How do we take this and create a virtuous circle, this regional zone where, in fact, we are able to take on the world as oil reaches $100, $150, $200 a barrel, which, by the way, it will. It's not going to happen this year, I predict. I'm on the board of a mid-size oil and gas company in Canada. I'm not going to give you any inside information. But I can assure you that if you look at what's happening in the world right now, oil will go to triple digits. It will continue to increase, and therefore this regionalization argument is really going to take hold. And there are other regions of the world doing more to cement those relationships and make themselves more competitive than we are. So I end where I began. The basic question set out by the Council on Foreign Relations. I think we're at an inflection point in the relationship between these three countries in North America. This is the time, ladies and gentlemen, coming out of this recession, 15 years later, looking at what the rest of the world is doing around regionalization. This is the time for us to stand back and say, do we see enough in North America? Is there enough there that is worth preserving and building on for the future? And do we believe that the answer to that question is yes? Do we have the courage and the focus and the leadership necessary to talk honestly to the people who live in our three countries, who will have to be convinced that there is something in it for them going forward in this concept of a North American region? You, I hope, realize where I come from this morning or this afternoon on this question. I would be very interested in your comments and views. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions. It's a small room, but for the recording, if you just wait till we bring the mic to you, please raise your hand and start right over here. Tell us your name and what you're studying as well.
Mike, and I'm studying political science. My question was, as I've heard some stuff in recent just talks about this issue of a North American community. I was wondering if it goes to that, and if we end up adopting the same kind of structure as the European Union, what are your thoughts on a common currency, and what would be, I guess, the problems that would pose, especially weighing the peso against both American and Canadian dollars?
We're not going there. Not in my life. Oh, sorry. I used to be a professor. I'm used to kind of moving around the room, and we're not going there. Not in my lifetime. Not in Earl's lifetime, right? Do you think? I don't think we're... Earl, by the way, I'm singling him out because he's done some great work on North America, and if you haven't read it, you all should. And he understands a tremendous amount about Canada and the NAFTA region. We're not going there anytime soon. The Amero is not on. Now, the U.S., there are serious issues around the dollar and whether the dollar will continue to be the only reserve currency in the world. And those are very serious questions that are going to have to be addressed. But that's separate and apart from the North American Amero issue. There is no political will. I'm talking about baby steps here, right? I am talking about simple things that I believe to be self-evidently in the interest of the three countries. What you're talking about, if you're looking at the European Union with its plethora of institutions, its bureaucracy, its own elected parliament, and so on, that is not on. And I am not talking about that. I would never talk about that because that will not happen for a very, very long time, if ever, in the North American region. Now, I know it's dangerous to say never because cataclysmic events happen and things change, as we've seen over the past 2 years. But absolutely, at this point, I would think in the foreseeable future, nothing like the European Union. Do we need to look at some other institutions? Like, for example, even a parliamentary association where the elected officials from the three countries get together on a regular basis? Yes, we have bilateral entities like that. Canadian parliamentarians get together with Americans or Mexicans and vice versa. But we don't have a body where the elected officials from the three countries come together, say once a year, and build relationships and talk about shared concerns. I'm looking at little things, low-risk things like that I would describe as baby steps, but I think would start in the minds of not only our leaders but the public to create this consciousness. That's really what I'm asking for, a consciousness around the fact that there is something in North America that could benefit us all and that it is worth fighting for.
My name is Justin Tyndall. I'm a Latin American Studies major. You mentioned that we need to take baby steps, and you talked about how since 2001, the U.S. Homeland Security has kind of hurt relations between all three countries. What would you say is the solution to the border problems in Canada and in Mexico that the U.S. is facing?
Actually, here, my solution is not a baby step. It's a pretty big step. It's the perimeter concept. Right? I think ultimately to deal with the problem of layering on restrictions at both the northern and southern borders, some of which are no longer based on a reasonable risk assessment around real threats to the homeland, that you will have to drive those borders out so that you in fact are screening people and goods at the perimeter of North America, and that once a person enters in Vancouver, LA, or Mexico City, they are screened to the satisfaction and standards of all three countries, and then they move freely through all three countries, very much like the European Union. Same thing for goods. A container should be screened offshore. I, in fact, when I was Minister of Public Safety, was working with the United States and Mexico on the Container Security Initiative, where we wanted to put our officers with American officers at that point in ports offshore, Rotterdam, Hong Kong, etc. And we would screen the containers destined for North America before they left port of origin. Therefore, once they came to North America, they would be sealed. If the seal wasn't broken, it would be an easy thing for those goods to move freely throughout North America upon landing at whatever port they chose on the west or east coast. That's where we have to go. We are bleeding the competitiveness that NAFTA was to deliver, and did deliver for 10 years, well, up until 2001. And we have seen the productivity gains, the competitiveness gains in relation to the rest of the world bleed away because of the layering on of restrictions on the northern and southern borders. And we are going to have to deal with that in a different way than we have so far. My preferred option is a bigger step. It is a perimeter concept. The Americans apparently now are willing to at least talk about a perimeter. I think it might involve Canada and the U.S. first, as some things do, and then they would deal trilaterally, and there's nothing wrong with that. Mexico is a developing nation. It may not be able to take up immediately all the things that the other two countries are in a position to do. That's okay. We just can't leave Mexico out of the dialogue. Yes, here, sorry.
Do you feel that the middle class of United States and Canada are so similar, and that the middle class in Mexico is very insignificant in comparison? There's such a vast difference between Canadian and American being similar, and Mexico being so different in that aspect, and so many people are so poor that it brings about its own massive amount of problems.
I think that's a very good point. I realize some people have to leave for class, so feel free. I will not at all be insulted or take it personally. And then I think we'll have one more question after this one. And then I think that's a very good point. Mexico is in the process of developing a middle class. It is a small middle class in proportion to their total population, unlike Canada's and America's, where the middle class is in fact the largest group of people in our two societies. Our two middle classes in Canada and the U.S. are very similar. They are not identical. And all you have to do is look at this healthcare debate in the United States to realize how different in key areas at least some in our two middle classes really are. But I take your point that overall, are those two middle classes similar? Absolutely. Mexico, the middle class in Mexico is not that much different in that they have the same aspirations for themselves and their children. They want their children to go to university, get a better education. They want to have good, sustainable jobs, and so on. All the things we in the middle class in Canada and the U.S. want for ourselves and our kids. The problem is the middle class is so small in Mexico, and the desperate poverty, the further south you go, adds an element of political instability. And the middle class in Mexico feels much more threatened than it does in either of our two countries right now. And that is a problem for a fledgling democracy if you start to bleed support for the democratic enterprise out of the middle class. So your question is a very good one. One more question. I think, well, I don't know which of you had. Choose among between yourselves.
Hi, my name is Kenny Kawa, and I'm a political science major. I'm actually from Ottawa.
Oh, good.
And so my question is, though...
That doesn't mean that all the rest of you aren't wonderful.
Okay, so my question is, actually with a little background. In February, President Obama visited Ottawa, and there was quite a warm reception to him in Canada. The media outlets dominated that event, where if you contrast that to September when Prime Minister Harper visited Washington, media outlets barely made mention of it. And I think a major stumbling block to our relationship is society's and media's awareness of the relationships and what's going on in either country. Now, you mentioned earlier that civil society needs to be more informed about a North American dialogue. How do you suggest we go about doing that and implementing it so that we create that the differences aren't so great between the actually three nations rather than the two?
A couple of things. One, I think that's a great question, and I do believe this discussion has to go beyond, has to go beyond chambers of commerce and business associations and industrial associations, right? Which is where this discussion has largely taken place around the future of North America, and it's all focused on competitiveness and enhanced productivity. You need your universities to talk about this. You need your think tanks to talk about this. You need your church organizations who travel to, for example, southern Mexico and do good work to take up the issue of whether there's something that real and worth fighting for in this thing called the North American region. And it will take time, and it's tough slugging, and it will take focus, and it won't happen overnight. But if we leave it, and we do need, it's got to be bottom up and top down. Our political leaders have to care about this, but then we have to care about it too, from the bottom up, in terms of our communities and identifying similarities. We should be encouraging professors and students to go to each other's institutions if they're committed to trilateral work. Look at working on issues that involve the three countries, getting more Mexican students to Canada, getting more Canadian and U.S. students into Mexico. And yes, language can be an issue, but Spanish is in fact the fastest growing language in the world today. Well, putting aside Chinese, Mandarin. More people are learning Spanish right now because of the growth of Latin America. Putting that barrier to one side, there's so much that we need to be doing. And universities, I challenge my own, the University of Alberta. We're doing nothing really in this area. And we have to cultivate students and faculty who care about the trilateral initiative, who care about North America, and in their research and their teaching create a critical mass of people who will feel comfortable talking about something called North America. The other point, your point about the fact Prime Minister Harper went to Washington and nobody noticed. We Canadians, as you know, are used to that. But look, the reality here, America is the world's only superpower. It will continue. Yes, it's going through some tough times. The thing the world needs to understand about America is you never count it out. And America will continue to be the world's only superpower for as long as I can imagine. Will the Chinese come up and start to share more of that power militarily and economically? Yes, absolutely. But America will continue to be the world's truly only superpower. So, everybody wants to go to Washington, right? Everybody wants their picture taken with the president because that's the place to be. And unfortunately, we're smaller than, we're not less than, we're just smaller than. Mexico is bigger than us population-wise, smaller GDP. They're smaller than. That's why the two of us together, maybe there's more we can do to get ourselves noticed in Washington when we come to town together and say, hey, we're here to talk about the hood, as George W. Bush would say. I think it could help us in terms of getting our voices heard and getting some attention in Washington. Okay, I know you had a question. What was it? And then you guys, I know, are having a fit. But, okay. What's your question?
My question.
Once I start, I can stay all afternoon, so don't worry. I'm good.
Last question.
Okay.
I had a couple questions. I'll just ask one. When you say about the whole perimeter concept, kind of the free movement of trade and labor and people, I was wondering how you think Quebec will respond to that.
It's interesting. Quebec was the biggest supporter, one of the biggest supporters of the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. They saw
Why don't you move the mic up to our guest? No, so she can wander with the mic
Yeah,
and then hand it off when she is.
Yeah, I do. I wander around. I apologize. It is the former teacher in me. So Quebec actually has ideologically and philosophically been very supportive of free trade. Now, do they have a fear that, for example, in Canada and the United States, taking those two countries, that a population of some 5-point-something million people, I think, would that be about right, Earl? That they get lost in this sea of Anglophones. Then you would layer on another concern, that they're going to get lost in another sea of Hispanics. So I think there is a concern, potentially. But they have shown themselves to be very supportive of free trade because they think they win at it. They think that there are things they can do, especially on the power side with hydro, right, in Hydro-Quebec. They see themselves as big winners, and I think they will, even in a North American context, if we get the North American continental energy piece right. They also see, because their power comes from hydro, that they could be a big winner in any continental climate change regime. And the Mexicans also see themselves potentially as winners because they're a developing nation in any kind of continental three-country climate change cap-and-trade system or green fund or whatever kind of project was ultimately put in place. So would it be a concern for Quebecers? Yes, because it's an ongoing concern that we get swamped, whether it's the English, whether it's the Spanish, whether it's the Chinese, Hispanics, the Chinese, we get swamped. We're this little group of people fighting hard for our self-realization, if you like. But at the end of the day, they're also pretty pragmatic people, and they've survived this long, and I think they have a strong culture from which they move forward. It's not going to be easily overwhelmed or taken over by others, and they do have some economic advantages that can make them, I think, an important part of a North American agenda. Okay, there, I think I'm done, but we should have done that earlier. That it would have been so much easier. Thank you. Anyway, thank you all very much.